One more minute and then I'll get started. People can continue to join us. Welcome if you're just arriving to our March learning meeting. And we have with us author Elin Kelsey, who we will be talking to about her latest book. I'm Judy Sheridan. I've been a member of CALL for a number of years. Today, I'm here with my colleague Joanne Hunter, and together we are the co-chairs of the Nature-Based Solutions Interest Group, and we welcome you today. Our meeting is going to mainly be our talk with Elin Kelsey about her book, and we're looking very much forward to that. We've set aside some time for you as the audience to reflect on the conversation and the topics that come up while we're during our discussion. We plan to offer opportunity to break out into small groups and breakout groups in Zoom. And I know some people may choose not to do that, and that's perfectly fine. We will ask you then to just personally reflect, just take a quiet few moments to reflect on the conversation, see how it makes you feel. And we're not going to do a report back from the breakout rooms in any formal way, but we have allowed a few minutes of time so that if there are people who do wish to share some of their reflections, you will be able to do that. We'll follow up with our action of the day, our regular feature, action of the day, just to look at a couple of upcoming events. Then we'll wrap up formally, but you're welcome to stay for our usual after chat. We'll leave the Zoom meeting open so we can continue our conversations after the formal meeting. So I look forward to all of this, and I'm going to hand it over to Joanne to introduce Elin.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'd like to introduce our speaker today, Elin Kelsey. We're very pleased that she agreed to come and talk to us again. Elin lives out west, so she rose early this morning to be here with us. For those who are not familiar with Elin's work, she is an award-winning author, speaker, and thought leader for the evidence-based hope and climate justice solutions movement. Her latest book, How to Be Hopeful: Empowering Practices to Overcome Despair and Act for Climate Justice, was published in October 2025. Elin's influence can be seen through the hopeful solutions focus of her clients, including the Monterey Bay Aquarium, the Near East South Asia Council of Overseas Schools, and other institutions where she has served as a visiting fellow, including the Rachel Carson Center for the Environment and Society, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Cone Foundation, the Salish Sea Institute, the Cairns Institute, and Stanford University. She co-created the viral social media campaign Ocean Optimism and is currently leading intergenerational collaborations with climate influencers to make evidence-based hope more shareable online. A best-selling children's book author, her picture books reveal the intimate connections between humans and the greater than human world. Her work as a podcast host, film writer, and exhibit creator celebrates the resilience that exists within ourselves and across species. Elin is an adjunct faculty member of the University of Victoria School of Environmental Studies and Western Washington University School of the Environment. If you want more information about Elin and the work she does, she has a website, www.elinkelsey.org. Welcome, Elin. It's so special to have you come and speak to us today. Start off our program today with a land acknowledgement with Elin.
Oh, thank you so much, Joanne. Yes, and I think that slide is probably coming. Here we are. Yes, I really wanted to appreciate the fact that I am coming to you on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam First Nations. And I think you may be able to see out the window behind me. We're in such an extraordinary place. I was sharing with the call members when we were getting set up that Since I've arrived here on campus, the UBC campus, since March 1st, the dominant bird song here is bald eagles. There are so many bald eagles calling and nesting in this area. It's extraordinary. I also wanted to call out Lillian Howard, a dear friend who passed away during COVID. The last time I was working on this campus, Lillian and I worked together on an International Environmental Communications Association workshop, and we were all over this campus doing a number of outdoor activities. But Lillian is such a inspiring person in my life, Muchalif origins, and just Eve Tuck, who's an Indigenous scholar at New York University, talks about this idea of pain stories as being a faulty theory of change. And for me, Lillian is the embodiment of that thinking. And what Eve meant, and what I think Lillian taught me, is that, it's extraordinarily important to recognize the wrongness in the world, things that are unjust, what is not appropriate, what is really damaged, and at the same time to see the resilience that sits within each of us as individuals and us as collectives and the greater than human world. That a pain story alone just it disempowers us. It disempowers those who have been suffering as a result of these problems. And instead, what we need to continuously try to develop in ourselves is the capacity to hold the reality and truth and call out the wrongness of that pain, and at the same time focus on the reality and truth and rightness of resilience. And so I just really feel Lillian with me today, and I'm really pleased to be here in that way, in a good way.
Thank you, Ellen.
Welcome.
Yeah, very nice, very thoughtful. Today, we're going to begin our conversation with you, Joanne and I. We've prepared a few questions, so hopefully we can prompt you with those and see where the conversation goes. I'm going to begin. So at the beginning of your book, How to Be Hopeful, you raise difficult questions like, how can you choose to be hopeful in a world plagued by global crises? What inspired you to write this book? And how is being hopeful important for those interested in acting for climate justice?
Oh, thank you, Judy. And I want to say thank you for this format of a more relaxed conversation. These are huge issues that are very emotion laden for all of us. And so, when we were planning this, our intention was to really talk in the most authentic way we can about this, which is also why that period of reflection in today's meeting feels so important. But I think it is in that vein, we recognize that we live in a planet in which our social systems, our human systems are incredibly unjust. We know that there's a huge disparity in access to all manner of things. And those injustices continue to play out in what many people talk about as, these collections of global crises. So whether we're looking at biodiversity loss or we're looking at plastic pollution, climate justice, all of them have at their core this real issue of injustice that sits underneath it. And so throughout my career, I've been really, really driven by how do we as ordinary people engage with these massive systemic problems. And in looking at that, there's such a tendency towards pain stories, towards what Eve talks about, which is to continuously focus on how broken something is, as if knowing better will cause us to act better. But there's now so much psychological research that shows that if you already know that something is really wrong, and we now know that the vast majority of people on Earth, I'll underscore that, are concerned about climate change. This is not a new idea. This is not something people don't know about. This is not something people don't feel deeply about. If you already know there's an extreme problem and all you hear about is how broken it is, then you're very unlikely to act, because you're just being inundated. And all we really do psychologically is turn off things or tune out things or or try to, hold ourselves. We keep attempting to do something helpful, but then we get beaten back. And we've got this kind of problem on top of the real issues we face in that less than 3% of all the media we hear about climate change even mentions a solution. So we continuously now know there's deep problems and only hear almost entirely about what's broken. And so I've just been obsessively interested in how do we break that focus on doomism. Michael Mann, the climate scientist, calls doomism, the new climate denial, because if you can convince people something's doomed, you also don't require any change. So there's a political aspect to it too. And so the most empowered stance you can come at is one in which you both can hold what's broken and you are staying as up to date as you can be on what things are moving in the direction we need more of. And so for all those reasons, I really now just believe that hope is a stance. It's a position I hold no matter what is happening. And I think that's a little different because often I think we might think that, oh, if something good happens, then I'll be hopeful. But I think it's the other way around. It's choosing to be hopeful no matter what, and then going to look for, okay, in this terrible circumstance, which things are having some successful results or big results even, and how do I throw myself behind that?
Yeah, it's so encouraging. So many disciplines you've brought together in this book that like I thought, oh, that's psychology, that's sociology, there's science. There were so many ideas from so many disciplines that you've brought together to help us to take that stance and put it forward. And I really appreciate that about the book.
Thank you.
Um, how to be hopeful. In How to Be Hopeful, you describe um, hope not as a personality trait, but as something we can practice and taking that stance that you've just described. In the book, you've told us about 5 stances that we can, I guess, like stand in that place that you're describing. And so could you just briefly introduce us to those 5 stances that you talk about in the book that can help us to cultivate this evidence-based hope?
Yes, and I will say I had such a challenge writing this book. This book did not want to be written. I don't know. It just did not want to be written. And one of the people on this call today is Maribeth Leatherdale, who's one of my dearest friends and a longtime editor for children's books that we've done together. I don't even think editor is the right word. We're just collaborators. Um, and people like Mary Beth and my daughter, Esme Johnson, were really helpful to me in trying to organize, like, what was I trying to say? Because in my book, Hope Matters, I was making an argument for hope. And in this book, you're quite right, Judy, I was trying to say, okay, how do you do this? What
Yes.
is the way of holding on to hope? And I realized it is around, for me, stances. It's like deciding how I stand
Yeah.
in the world. So there are 5. The first is I choose hope, I just choose it. And the second is, I reject fatalism. Like there's such fatalism is the idea that, things are bad and they're just going to stay bad, or oftentimes people assume they'll get even worse. And what I've really realized around that stance is being able to stay in fear is a really powerful way to not fall into fatalism. So what I mean by that is when I hear something is going on and I know, oh man, that really worries me. That's super wrong. Instead of saying, oh, now I know where that's going, or speaking as if that's now the truth, like that outcome is a
Yes.
guaranteed thing, I try to say, I am scared out of my mind that that could happen. But as long as I'm still in the something could happen, I don't know the future. My stance is I'm not going to speak as if that's fatalistically determined. I'm going to hold that stance that I just reject fatalism and I'll stay in the fear and I can be very well informed in my fear, but I'm not going to be fatalistic. And then the third stance is I am emotional. We're hugely emotional. And in the last decade or so, there's been a real growth in a discipline I'm very involved in, which is called climate emotions. And it's really looking
Hmm.
at how we feel has a tremendous impact on whether or not we engage with things. And for the longest time, it was, most of the psychological research around this was around cognition. What do we know and how does what we know affect us? Knowing stuff really does matter, of course,
Of course.
but how we feel, the combination of anger at injustice and hope, these are very empowering emotions, and fear and creating cultures of fear is really disempowering. And really, we get way less creative when we're afraid. We get way less collective when we're afraid. So creating cultures of fear is a very powerful political move to do, for example. So I am emotional. And then the fourth is I'm on a reparative quest. So I recognize that we live in this planet in which our human systems are very unjust. And so everything I'm doing is always in a repair mindset. There's a lot of restoration that needs to happen within ecological systems and within social systems and within relationships. It's a reparative quest. And then the fifth one, and where personally I get the most hope, is that I am nature. I just am. I'm only breathing because of these folks out here, and I'm only digesting food because of the microorganisms that co-live, within whatever this is. So this real connection and recognition of the agency, positionality, individuality of other species sits within the stance of I am nature.
Wonderful. Well, when I got your book, there's so much in it. It's so full. I couldn't just start at the beginning and read to the end. I couldn't process that. There was just too much. And so I looked at the structure that you built using the stances, and it really helped me to take an approach. If I was like kind of inspired by I'm emotional, then I could turn to that
Mhm.
stance and then start to read. And I found that was a very good way for me to go into the book. And I must compliment you because right at the beginning you invited all of your readers to do that. That it's
Mhm.
not, it's not constructed that you must take it this way, that you can look at this book and discover for yourself in the way that's comfortable. And I just felt much less overwhelmed by having the permission to go ahead and open it in the middle and get started. So I do think it's very well organized ex from an accessibility point of view. You can go at it and take the chunks and absorb that and reflect and move on to the next. So that's the way I've enjoyed the book so far.
Good. I
Um,
appreciate that.
thank you. And Joe, um, I'm going to turn it over to you to ask a question.
Thanks, Judy. So in the first stance, choose hope, Ellen, you describe hope as something we actively practice rather than simply feel. Looking at the constellation of practices, you outline for this particular stance, or can you outline one or two of the most transformational actions that people can take who are feeling overwhelmed by climate news?
Yeah, and I'm going to laugh at myself because you're quite right, Joanne. The book is broken into stances and then practices to support those stances. Um, but because I think these things are so integrated, I'll just tell you some of the stances I find personally the most helpful, and you may find them in a different section of the book, but but I think they're really relevant. So one of them is and it's one of my favorite things. I check the expiry date constantly on what I'm sure I know. So part of what feeds hopelessness, um, it really is this tie between hopelessness and doomism. So when you think, I know what's going to happen here now, I know what's the story of whatever the issue is, I know this, I know where this is going, then we're very unlikely, most of us, to go looking to say, I wonder what's happening in that area. Has anything moved in that area? Especially when we care a lot about it. And different people have said, it's really hard to learn something that you already know. It's the same idea. We get so locked in. So one of the things I do is I just treat what I know the same way as I treat the things in my fridge. So when I open my fridge, I know there's things in there that are fresh and new and up to date. And there are things way in the back that are well past their expiry date. And I try to think about knowledge in the same way. I think, when was the last time I really looked to see what is the state of renewables in terms of, for example, and I know now that last August, was the point where more electricity was generated by renewables than coal for the first time. That kind of thing is really important to know, because then when I'm hearing discussions where people are renewables will never happen, or they won't happen quick enough, or the kinds of things we say as if we know, I'll think to myself, wow, I'm pretty out of date on that. I got to check again to see where I'm at. And one of them that's very encouraging to me personally is I've worked a lot in marine protected areas. Throughout my whole life, I've been very marine oriented. And I talk to many groups. And each time I talk, I check to see what's the status of the percentage of marine protected areas on Earth. And I'm happy to say, even though I do talks every week, I have to update that slide every week. That is a very active area. And not just, in terms of accumulated regions, but also the scale of individual marine protected areas. We're more likely to have ecosystem scaled ones now rather than just small parts of the ocean. And so it's one of those, that's a practice I do all the time. I just keep checking my expiry date on what I'm sure I know.
Thank you. In Reject Fatalism, the second stance, you encourage people to challenge narratives that say, it's too late, the damage has been done, or this problem cannot or will not be solved. Which practices do you believe would help people most in recognizing and interrupting fatalistic thinking, both within and in conversation with others? In other words, how can people reframe these narratives to maintain a sense of agency and possibility?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I really appreciate that you're asking that, Joanne, because I think it is often in conversation. And then there's this whole social piece that's going on around that, that I think we signal that we care about something often by sharing our agreed upon worry about it. So if someone says this is really, wrecked, we're likely to say you're right, as a way of saying I also care about that. And so in that chapter of the book, I was really looking at research around cynicism, for example, that one of the things that happens because we almost only hear about what's broken, and it's important that we hear about what's broken. I want to keep underscoring these are massive global issues and they are real and urgent. And we almost only hear about how broken they are. We almost don't hear anything about the other 97% also of things that are also happening. Um, so that coverage needs to be much, much more fulsome. Um, Cynicism is fascinating. As an outcome of hopelessness, we often become more cynical. And we carry a social norm around that people who appear cynical, uh, psychologists tell us we're more likely to think of them as intelligent. So when you choose to be hopeful as a stance, not only are you choosing a countercultural stance, but you're doing it in a way that people will think you're less smart, So I think that's really important to know. That's really hard. And so even just knowing that and recognizing that. And so what I try to do as a practice there is I recognize that we're all emotional. The reason the person I'm speaking with is saying, it's too late, it's whatever, is because they feel deeply, they love this thing and they're really concerned, as I am. And so I try to make space to feel the emotion, to hear that emotion, to validate the emotion, and then to say, and it's interesting, I wonder if this thing that, we're feeling is already too late. I wonder if it is too late. And I find myself, now I'm speaking as I would speak in that conversation. It's like, I need to go and check this because I haven't stayed up to date on this. I need to know what is the state of play around this particular issue. What is happening with um, plastic pollution, for example. And I know there was a major plastic treaty that has evolved, a global treaty on plastics because of people's concern around plastic. What happened at the last meetings around that plastic, that kind of thing. So I think in that sense, I try to really empathize because I do empathize with the emotions and validate those as my collective and still leave room to challenge the assumptions of too late or out of date or those kinds of things, so that I'm bringing new content into that conversation.
I'm going to move on to another question, a prepared question And this is directed at the stance of I am emotional, which you've talked about, Ellen, validating the full range of feelings that people experience around climate change. And in this chapter, you share how people can work with difficult emotions like grief and anger in ways that deepen their engagement rather than lead to burnout or paralysis. Can you talk a little bit more about practices that could be helpful in transforming difficult emotions into energy for connection and meaningful action? So how do we take that so strong often emotions and emotional energy and transform that and
Mhm.
use it, which is what you're guiding us to do.
Mhm. Yeah, and again, I always think the exciting thing about a book is that you're so influenced by other people's thinking, and they really can help you to see things. So Maisha Cherry is an academic who works a lot on anger, and I really appreciated one of the things she says, and I included in the book, is this idea that, when I think about love, love is very important to me. I'm sure it's very important to most of us. And I have lots of kinds of love. I have maternal love, I have romantic love, I have the love I feel in these connections with all of this greater than human world. And Maisha encourages us to think of anger in the same way, that we have lots of facility and capacity to differentiate many kinds of anger. And I find that a very, very helpful thing because I think in some cases there are certain emotions I have that I haven't explored as deeply or haven't allowed myself to feel as much. And so increasing my versatility in a range of angers has been really useful to me to really kind of welcome them in those ways. And then, um, I've been so lucky to work with Indigenous scholars, some of who work in the idea of felt theory. So the ideas of, really appreciating that how we feel is a whole theory of action associated with that, rather than positioning feelings somewhere underneath what we think or know. So just even in that chapter, I'm really trying to open up space to welcome the broad range of emotions that we have, and also to see our emotions as socially constructed as well. So not only do we feel something, but I feel differently if I only hear about problems than I do when I'm
Yes.
bathed, for example, there's been this rise of a wonderful field called solutions journalism. It's increasing all over the world now, I'm happy to say. And in solutions journalism, the role of the journalist is to look just as rigorously at where things are moving in better directions as they do at what's broken. So it's a more fulsome story of the news. And there are many more sources of solutions journalism. And we know environmental journalists, scholars study what's the impact of negative news on us, on our emotions, and on our capacity to engage with these issues. And there's horrifying things like just a few moments of negative news really impacts your whole day. So in that chapter, I'm trying to talk about really honoring what we feel and recognizing when those feelings are being structured because of the news we have access to. And so one of the practices I do is really changing my news sources to solutions journalism. That changes everything because it means I'm starting my day or feeding my day with examples of here's what's working in this place. How could it be tailored or amplified in this setting? Here's what these people are doing over here. And what the Solutions Journalism Network did that I think is brilliant is they recognize that reporting on solutions takes more time because solutions involve more people, more disciplines, it's more comprehensive. And so they've created fellowships for journalists to learn how to do solutions journalism so that newsrooms will have more space. And I think one of the things driving solutions journalism is there's a major academic field that studies news avoidance. And what that is us turning off the news because we just can't take that negativity anymore. And of course, news outlets don't want you to do that. So the rise of news avoidance, which has been very swift, is also causing a movement towards more solutions journalism in mainstream journalistic places.
Very encouraging. I'm one of those people who turns off the news.
Hmm. Yeah. And I think that's important. It's really important to step away and take that break. And it's really important to find sources that allow you to still hear about what's happening, but in a solutions framing. Both are true.
Yes, very encouraging to know that journalism as a practice
Hmm.
is now moving in that direction.
Hmm.
I've worried about journalism for quite some time in that people are getting their news from informal places much more than they're going to structured and sometimes I consider more trustworthy sources. And so and turning away from like the newspapers and the television news and moving to YouTube, which is really unstructured. You have to be very, very careful or very considerate of what you're taking in and evaluating, critical of all these sources. And so to know that there's a part of journalism that's moving towards this more fulsome look at what's really happening and not just sensationalizing parts of the news is very encouraging to me, just in itself. So
Hmm.
I'll be
Yeah.
looking for those sources. They're probably listed in the book, and you'll tell us a little bit more about that, I think.
Yeah.
Um, reparative, being on a reparative quest of transformation is one of the stances in the book. And it focuses on healing relationships and taking meaningful action. So, of the many practices in your book, could you suggest one or two you think would help people most moving from awareness to repair? And if you could, a practice perhaps for the individual and a practice that could fit into a community in which we are involved.
Mm. Yeah, that's a beautiful question. Yeah, I think the origin of that stance really came because often when I'm speaking to people about hope, um, there can be for some people an assumption that hope is a privilege. It's something that only some people are able to have if other needs are met, that sort of thing. And I was I have been very lucky to talk to people about hope in lots of places and lots of circumstances, and I've come to see it the exact opposite way. I think that hope is something that, um, I've talked to people who are end of life care, palliative nurses. So, I guess something I should say around all of this is what hope means. I just finished being part of this big Oxford compendium on hope, and there are over 70 scholars writing about hope, and every one of them interprets hope in a different way. It's a very complex, comprehensive concept. For some, it's psychological, for some, it's spiritual, for some, it's behavioral, for some, it's very large and robust and keep me busy for the rest of my life. But I think that's really important to that. And this idea that there's an inherent hopefulness that sort of allows us to keep going after horrible things have happened. So after the worst, in a way, hope is there. So I don't see hope as a privilege at all. I see it as an essential thing. And there are examples I draw in the book. There's an incredible center in South Africa that looks at reparative quest within post-apartheid where issues continue to still be. So you have a whole sense of a new beginning, and then that beginning doesn't play out in the way that one would, deeply need. And so how does hope continue in those kinds of circumstances? I think there's so much to learn always in these ways. So one of the things in that chapter I think is so important is an ongoing exploration for myself anyway around forgiveness. And Maisha Cherry, who I mentioned earlier with anger, one can continue to be angry and still forgive. You can hold those two things together. I just find so many things are much more complicated than the ways I might have thought about them, that we can hold multiple stances. So, of course, we can be furious at injustice and we can be moving forward in relational repair in order to counter that injustice. All of these things are true. And I like this thought there. I just can't think of the name of the person at this moment. I apologize. He's a Stanford academic who's working in forgiveness and talks about, when I forgive, I'm choosing to move forward, because otherwise I'm caught forever in something that's happened. I'm making a choice to acknowledge, again, with the pain story idea, to acknowledge the wrongness of something and at the same time to move with it, both at the same, So I think rather than it's really the practice of exploring the concept of how do I move forward. So I'll give you a more specific example. Many young people feel institutional betrayal. I think many of us feel it, but I know in our climate emotions research where we look at eco-anxiety, so fears about what's happening on the planet or a real fear about the future. Many young people feel they won't even have a future. There is no chance of a future. And in those feelings, part of what fuels that is institutional betrayal. So the kinds of institutions that are supposed to look after us, governance systems, ministries of whatever, have failed us. And so in that chapter, I look at not only institutional betrayal and therefore seeing we are talking about betrayal. Like, so if we're trying to do a reparative quest, we need to recognize that's what people are feeling. That's a very strong feeling. Any of us who have been betrayed know what that feels like. That takes a lot of work to try to find our way forward in that. Um, and there are people who work on the opposite of institutional betrayal, which is institutional courage. And in institutional courage, and that's something we can do collectively, we can say, how are we going to operate as a group of people that's courageous? And what that means is full transparency, for example. Every decision we make very public. We show it everywhere. And I think we even see this now in terms of many youth-led organizations in their democratic processes they are using institutional courage frameworks that show total transparency, real, if the same issue came up again, would it be treated properly? Would you feel your voice was heard?
That's amazing. Just, it's so very encouraging to think that we can take a hold of these things, acknowledge them, and work to move forward. Very empowering. Thanks, Ellen.
You're welcome. And hard, really hard.
And
Like I
it
just really
sounds
want to
really, I know
underscore it's
it's
hard. Yeah. And
really
when
hard.
people
I
think
know.
about hope, they often think, oh, I mean, smiling and cheerful or whatever. Hope is hard. Hope is really hard, and really necessary.
Yeah, that idea of holding the two emotions at the same time, really challenging too. Um,
Yeah.
being able to express both.
Yeah.
Well, I'm really drawn to nature, and and I was very glad to see that you had a stance in your book entitled "I Am Nature." So, so in this chapter, Ellen, you invite readers to experience themselves as integrated with the living world, including the more than human world, rather than being separate. So, my question to you is, why do you think our relationship with nature is so important?
Mhm.
And maybe you can start with that. And I have a second part of my question.
Yeah, well, because we are nature, so it's essential. It's such a hard thing to talk about. I guess it's maybe easiest to talk about it in contrast to the duality of humans and nature that so many of us grew up being told and taught. And I was looking recently again at this concept of plant blindness, and that's a term by botanists use to refer to. I find this really fascinating, and if you have special young people in your life, it's a thing to work on. So the idea is that when we're babies, we really, we look at everything. We are entranced by the leaves, we're entranced by the insects, we see everything. But we quickly learn, we're socialized in many cultures to only see certain members of that community. So, for example, if I was holding up a picture of an elephant in the African savannah and I was showing it to a young child, there's a huge tendency for me to say, "Oh, do you see the elephant? Here's an elephant or here's a zebra," and not to say, "Oh, here's a picture of acacia trees," and so the end result of that is there are studies that show young children recognize all of those species and look at all of them But by the time they get to preschool, they've learned to prioritize or privilege certain members that are more likely to be the mammals, because that's what we keep pointing out. So again, a lot of these things are learned, like our separation from things. We learn constantly. We talk about nature and humans, like as if they're separate. So I think it's really important to reclaim our ecological identities in the ways we speak about them. There's plenty of research now that shows the health benefits of our time spent more actively immersed in nature-based settings. That'll be no surprise to most of you, time spent outdoors. But even that, the language of outdoors, it's such a separating language. Um, but yeah, I mean, there's both if we were to say from a selfish standpoint, we feel better in these environments, we do better in these environments, but beyond that, we just are part of those environments. Like we're all pollinators. In one of the books I did with Mary Beth, I say, every time we blow a kiss to the world, we spread pollen that might grow to be a plant. That's because we are actually pollinators. So we are in the systems, whether or not we choose to recognize that or not.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, I'm always drawn to the example of trees and how we exchange so much with trees, and
Mhm.
they give us oxygen for life, and we breathe out carbon dioxide, which they need, and then all the things that happen underground and all the connectedness that actually goes on within nature, and yet we see ourselves as so different, so separate from all these processes around us, which we are actually a part of.
Mhm.
So the next part of my question is, are are there a couple of practices that you can share with us that you think help people to connect more with nature so that they feel a part of the greater whole? And I think that's inspiring in moving us towards action as well.
Mhm. Well, an extreme practice, some people might find it extreme, but I don't, is I sleep outside a lot. And I don't find that extreme, but it's an unusual thing to do. It's just an extension of, doing as much work as you can outside. When I teach, I usually teach outside. And if I'm teaching online, I encourage students to be also outside, and then we just connect by, these sorts of ways. Um, so that whole making choices about where you're spending time is a big thing. And I think also um, many of us live in cities, and just that idea, like not long ago, I was really thinking about the fact, because of the way we attribute rights, and there's lots of movement around animal rights and rights for other species, and recognizing that is a very changing landscape. Rights for rivers, rights for parts of the ocean. A lot of things are happening there that are exciting to me. Um, but really recognizing that anytime we are in a living space, any other species is in a way illegal. That we only have property rights for people. And so really opening up our minds to, is this really my yard? Is this really my boulevard? These ideas, and saying, no, there's a multi-species collective that lives in this city. And what's the etiquette that I might use to reflect my recognition that this is a multi-species space, that the choice to eat, where the access to water is, all of those things are are not sort of mine to give. They're a collective living space that is in this weird idea right now of private property, So really just um, establishing a multi-species etiquette for the city is one of the practices I do. And, even how I move past a bird. I think I start the book talking about watching a crow in a crosswalk, and the crow is standing there waiting. We know there are a number of species that use crosswalks. You've probably seen species using crosswalks, but we almost don't accept that. But they are, some species do. There's lots of research to show that they do. They learn to use crosswalks. And so, for example, do I then stop if I see a crow in the crosswalk? Or do I think, oh, yeah, these are just for people? So, really sort of catching ourselves in the assumptions we make about other species, and moving by, more quietly, or moving, like taking more space to recognize a quick movement might be interpreted this way, whereas a more gentle movement might be really make a big difference for the energy transfer of that animal, and whether it has to fly off or whether it can just continue to feed. So multi-species etiquette, I think, is really one thing I find really important.
Anything else that you'd like to share around our connectedness with nature and how we can do that as individuals? And
Yeah, well, I mean, you have your committee of your nature-based solutions, so I think you're already really thinking about this. Where I'm very happy to say that many, many countries have signed on now to this 30 by 30 agreement, which is to protect 30% of land and ocean by the year 2030. And in order to reach that, a lot of that will require ongoing ecological restoration. And it turns out that what we do in our yards does make a big difference. Some of the recoveries around monarch butterflies, for example, have been directly attributed to the kinds of plants people plant on their window boxes or on their green roofs or those kinds of things. Or the city of Toronto um, took permitting processes for green roof requirements as a result of looking what the Toronto School District did first with its green roofs and then moving that. So politically, we can advocate for, what we saw in schools, we now demand in our city, and now New York City has picked up what Toronto did. So, we can watch and see the progression of nature-based solutions and advocate for those. So I think that's partly what I'm trying to say in the book too, is that a lot of times we say to ourselves, well, even if I do this one little thing, that's the best I can do. I'm really challenging us to say, actually, a lot of people are doing those little things, and they are collectively a lot of things. Um, the reason we have a global plastics treaty is because of the number of people fighting against plastic pollution. These things turn into big things. We just saw this last year, a treaty for protection of the high seas. So the high seas is the amount of ocean that is not in what we consider national territorial rights, which is actually almost all of the ocean. And I never thought in my life that I would see a treaty for the high seas, but we now have one. It came into law just this January. So it's important, again, to stay up to date on what is changing and then advocating for more of it, which is why I think solutions journalism is so powerful, because when you know something does work, you can demand it, rather than just pointing out what's broken and saying we can't have any more of this brokenness. That's also important. But pointing to that and saying, hey, it's happening over here. Why is it not happening there? A lot of transit justice in cities is really less cars to the benefit of all species, so, and to the benefit of all of us. How we move about cities really matters to other species and ourselves are other species.
thank you very much um, for this conversation. It's
Mm.
been really great.
Joanne, I just want to ask you to do a final reflection on the conversation before we move to exciting action of the day.
Thank you, Judy. So, as we disclose our discussion, I'd like to pause and reflect on what we've heard today from Elin and from others. Um, Often we talk about climate change, or more broadly, the state of the world. When we talk about these things, it leaves us feeling very overwhelmed and discouraged and even powerless. I know I have experienced all of those things. What Ellen reminds us in her book and throughout this conversation is that hope begins with a choice. Choosing hope does not mean denying reality. It means refusing to surrender to despair. It means deciding that even in difficult circumstances, our actions still matter. What I find most powerful in Ellen's message is that hope is not something reserved for extraordinary people. It's something we practice in our ordinary moments, in the conversations we have, in the choices that we make, and in the way that we show up for our communities. Hope grows when we see ourselves not as individuals, isolated individuals facing an impossible problem, but as part of a much larger network of people and even species working towards resilience and renewal. So perhaps going forward, we can treat hope as something we can actively cultivate, to notice the stories we tell ourselves about the future, to seek out the evidence of change and possibility that is already happening, and to remember that our actions, especially when combined with others, help shape what comes next. Thank you, Ellen, for helping us to see hope as a powerful evidence-based practice, one that calls on us to stay engaged, stay connected, and keep imagining the more positive futures we are capable of creating together. And now I would like to invite Ellen to present us with Action of the Day.
Well, that was so beautiful, what you said, Joanne. And maybe if we go to the slide, if that's okay.
Next slide, please.
Yes, that would be great.
Thank you.
So these are just some of the sources that you can sign up for. You'll get them either as an e-newsletter on your email if you wish, or you can just check in with them. And so my action for the day is to make a decision to look at solutions-oriented journalism. Because when you do that, and then I was thinking it could be a really interesting action as a collective, because what a powerful group you are. I mean, I was so inspired by the work you do and the ways in which you do it. And I think it could be really interesting at each meeting, perhaps, to share out a solution that's really inspired a member of your group, or, to really make a decision to be a community of hope, of evidence-based hope in the way that you do your climate action. I think that in my experience, it's really hard to hold on to a stance of hope by yourself because of the constant hearing about what's broken. But when people do it as a collective, and when they do it as a collective, it's much more powerful. So it might be something, and just to inspire you, I was speaking to some students a couple of years ago, and one of the students came up to me afterwards and said, I want to create hope announcements for my school, because we hear announcements every day at school and they're always negative. And so she went ahead and did that, and now that's a whole program schools are doing. So this idea of how do we share this as a cultural practice, I think is really important. So to do it individually and to do it collectively, and then to think about, just as Irma so beautifully said, looking with as a teacher, a retired teacher, and as a grandparent, how do I share these things that are moving in directions we need more of as a normal way in which I talk about the world? I think that really normalizing that is important. So that's my action of the day.
Thanks for bringing that to us, Ellen. That's great and very encouraging, and certainly an area that I'm inspired to look into more and to make sure that I'm exposing myself, but thinking about it also, I can share that with family and friends as well, which starts to grow the whole movement. So I want to thank you very much for being with us today. It's been super for you to take this time with us and for us to explore these ideas with you, and we can go on forward and continue exploring. And we just very much appreciate your time today. And your book is also very inspiring. And I must say, when I looked at your books and saw that you'd done quite a few children's books, I was very excited. I also have young grandchildren, so I've got The Last Goodbye here on my table, and I'll go looking at the library for more books. So thank you for those as well, for all of your work that you do.
Okay, well, if you are interested in reading Ellen's book, it's available at the public library. You can get it there. Thank you all for joining us today. We're really happy to have you part of this and part of our collective.
Thanks, Joanne, Judy.
Yes. Thank you very
Sharon,
much for
thank you.
coming.
Yeah,
Glad
thank you
enjoyed it.
so much. Thank you. Ellen was incredible.
It was very
Thank you so
exciting.
much. Now we're all going to go outside and be with nature, right?
Go outside, look at the sun is shining if you're
Okay. Take care,
near it.
everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Take care.
You
Have a
too.
wonderful